Good afternoon. I'm Matthew Burt, the project director for All Saints Company, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this second of three conversations with Rick Fabian. Rick is the author, as many of you know, of Signs of Life, Worship for a Just and Loving People, book available from Amazon and all fine booksellers, and published this past fall. And I'm delighted that today he is in conversation with his former colleague, Daniel Simons, who is most recently the new priest in charge of St. Paul's on the Green in Norwalk, Connecticut. And though as formerly was here in San Francisco with us and was on staff at St. Gregory's, the church that Rick Fabian co-founded in 1978. Their topic today is going to be the sign of the Eucharist. They're going to speak in dialogue for about 30 minutes, after which there will be an opportunity for participants to ask questions. So thank you so much for being with us, Daniel and Rick, and we look forward to your conversation.
Thank you.
We do. We look forward to it too.
See what happens next. Rick, I was just looking on the calendar, noticing that you were scheduled to be here at St. Paul's this past Sunday doing a book. So I think we've enlarged the circle. And
COVID-19 interrupted that. We've got something better. I think Zoom's even better. I really like it.
Well, good to see you. Good to see you as live as we can get in this moment, and everyone else online. So I'm going to jump right in. Last week, you said that marriage, the sacrament of marriage, you chose because it was the most ubiquitous, central. It's everywhere. It's progressive. Everybody has easy access to understanding it. Not so the Eucharist. The Eucharist is peculiar to Christians, and you say in the book that it is a principal access point, easier than baptism, and yet it's a scandal. It remains a scandal. So that means in some ways it's very important still. And say more about why it's still a scandal and why it's important.
Well, it's still a scandal, in fact, it was from, scandal is a Greek word meaning a stumbling block. And in the book of Leviticus, the commandment comes, do not throw a stumbling block before the blind. So whenever the Bible talks about scandal, it's really talking about blindness. The question is, can we see the sign or not? If you can't see it, you're going to fall over, and that's rather dangerous. So the Eucharist is a sign of what God is doing everywhere in the world, and we want people to see it, and that's really what makes it. It's always startling. It was startling from the beginning. The first voice that thought this up was the prophet Isaiah, who had prophesied, envisioned a banquet for all the nations. Now, in our days of United Nations, that sounds like we send out formal invitations and everybody comes dressed. But actually, in biblical times, your religious identity and your ethnic identity were like skin color. They never changed. The only way to be a Jew was to be born one, and other ethnic groups were born to that, and the ethnic groups all got along kind of testily, often warlike. The Bible's full of that. So Isaiah had a startling vision. It was very unusual in his time for all the ethnic groups to dine together. I have it was something that he envisioned and he never saw. Nobody in his lifetime saw that. It was contrary to everybody's experience of what it is to have other ethnic groups next door or in the next county or whatever. It was very different. And it is my book ends with a story. I think it helps to make it concrete. A story today, well, only about 20 years ago, by Geoffrey Morehouse, a British writer who traveled across the Sahara with Tuareg tribesmen riding camels. And he discovered that when they arrived at an oasis or a well in the desert, and they saw other Tuaregs on the other side of the well, everybody dismounted and threw sand into the air in patterns to show to identify their clans, because the Tuaregs don't want to dine accidentally with somebody of a rival clan. If once they have dined together, Tuaregs may never fight. Now, in Jesus' time, most religious leaders lived like that. Everybody was supposed to dine with their own group only. There were many of them, and they were distinct by how pure they were. The leader's job was to do a pure job, so that if we can get everybody to have a pure dining group, God will bring the kingdom, the reign of God, and put Israel back on top where it belongs. And and Jesus taught, on the contrary, that God's reign is not in the future; it's here already, and we must respond, or we're in deep trouble. And there is so he took Isaiah's vision and did it, and he did it himself, and he began dining with people that other religious teachers shunned. They were people of other ethnic groups, or people who had to deal with people of other ethnic groups, or people who just broke the Mosaic laws all over the place. Jesus began dining with the wrong people. And it's clear that as soon as he began doing it, he was on a path to death. It was shocking and scandalous at the time, and that's probably why he said at least once, this dining with the wrong people is my sacrificing my body and blood. That's probably what he meant by it.
Say more about the deep trouble that we're in if we don't pay attention, because in some ways that's the, well, gets himself in deep trouble for paying attention.
Yeah, I don't need to say a whole lot about it. Every issue of the New York Times contains articles on every page about what's going wrong. So and we are the contest between us, the lack of peace, the lack of mutual understanding, the lack of generosity. It's everywhere. So I have what we need to do is recognize what God is doing, not just for your people, not just for your party, not just for your religious group, but for everybody in the world. That's what, and that road lies to peace instead. I'm afraid that the newspapers are full of what goes wrong if you don't do that.
I want to talk about what is in the newspapers right now, and link it to Eucharist. Something that churches have been talking about quite a lot these days is in the era of COVID-19, how do, I want to reframe the question. It's not how do we do Eucharist? We're doing it. But in a time when we cannot physically be with one another, breaking bread, sharing wine, there's been a lot of conversation around what's valid, what's possible. I suspect that you would talk about some deeper issues and larger questions that we should be paying attention to.
Yes, indeed.
Go for it.
Since you mentioned validity, I will say, because last year, excuse me, valid is a military term. It's if you're a general and you're leading troops across a river, you care about whether the river will hold them or not. Validus, or viveus in Greek, means it's firm. The soldiers will not fall in the river and drown. There is a foolish distinction made of partially valid, which means that I suppose that the bridge will carry some of the soldiers over the bridge, but not others. No sane general would lead his troops over such a thing. So we're trying to find out, was it real? Can you rely on it? That's what it stands for. Now we've had a lot of fighting about it in the past, which I think is irrelevant to the coronavirus. There is what the coronavirus is giving us a time when we actually, a lot of us, don't have bread and wine. And the question is Christ present or not? Now, Christ is present everywhere. The Eucharist doesn't make Christ present. It's a sign of Christ's presence, but Christ is present everywhere. Gregory of Nyssa, who is our patron saint, St. Gregory's, in his time, the empress made it fashionable to go on pilgrimages to Jerusalem. And Gregory of Nyssa said, you don't need to do that. Since the resurrection, Christ is everywhere. Now, 12 centuries later, Martin Luther argued against people who said, oh, Jesus is gone, he's not here anymore. No, the ascension at the end of the story of Jesus' life, the resurrection, the ascension into heaven, the ascension means that Christ now fills all things. So the question for us in the time of coronavirus, I don't know how long, nobody knows how long this is going to last or how we will handle it. If it goes on for 18 months, I cannot predict what the bishops are going to say. I am not telling bishops what to say is outside my domain. Bishops usually say what they think the church has already decided. So it's not, at least they struggle to do that, poor fellows. And I want to talk about what we're doing. I think that one of the important elements of the Eucharist is getting the presence of Christ Christ arrives in the ritual of the Eucharist. Christ arrives, which means we of course we meet Christ everywhere, but we greet Christ as though we have the experience of his coming to greet us. And that's the experience. When he comes to greet us, he comes with authority to empower us to do justice and peace, to live as he did, as God thinks all people should live. And you may have heard of the second coming. The Bible talks about a second coming of Christ, and let me say that that's not something to wait for. In the second, if you're interested in the second coming of Christ, it happens this Sunday at 10 o'clock in the morning in your parish. Christ arrives with authority to spread the authority for doing justice and peace. That it's already there. It's too late to plan for it. So now what we've got is a period when nobody's meeting in your church. So where are you going to find it? Well, one of the things I like about the Zoom is that it shows I can only see 5 people across the top of my screen, but I know there are more out there. I could push the more button over and over and see lots of people there. It strikes me when I watch St. Gregory's Zoom service on Sundays that there are an awful lot of people sharing the work of Christ. They talk about it either during the service or afterward in coffee hour. You hear them talking about doing justice and so forth. And increasingly they do that. As the weeks go by, I hear more and more of that. I hear less of people wondering what's going to become of me, and more talking about what they're doing. And I think that's one of the reasons that I think that's liturgically important is the Byzantine Eucharist begins with the deacon crying. Every Sunday, it begins with the deacon crying, "It is time for the Lord to act." And Christ, meeting Christ in the liturgy, in the company of other Christians, meeting Christ means it's time for you to act too. Christ empowers us to act. So if you're looking for a way to realize that properly, that means to make real. To make real in your experience, the presence of Christ, the thing to do is think of somebody to make peace with and go make it. Think of someone to forgive and forgive them. It's the kind of action that God is doing everywhere. Let the Spirit of Christ guide you as we get together, even on screen if we get together. And I enjoy hearing about people who are doing that. Increasingly, that's what I hear with the sharing that goes on in the coffee hours and so forth.
You may have just answered this, but as you were talking, what popped to mind was something I remember you saying before you wrote this book, it was the question you were asking increasingly. It was formulated something like, what is it that we think we are doing on a Sunday?
Yes.
Which is a different question than what are we doing, but what do we think we're doing? What is our intention?
Exactly.
And I feel like I just heard you answer that, or at least in a way that I haven't heard before, of saying we are, it's a very specific answer. We're making peace and doing justice.
Yes. In
But
response to meeting
say
Christ.
more. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and what you in the Eucharist, we become, first of all, we become aware of what the Eucharist is, a sign of what Jesus did, which he meant to be a sign of what God is doing everywhere. The sign of the Eucharist was a sign, his sign of his teaching about God in action, and it involves people that you would not invite to dinner with you. There are always people in church with you that you would prefer not to have dinner with, but they're there, and that's what. And part of our work is to welcome them the way Jesus did, and welcome so forth. They may not. I think we mislead ourselves if we think that the people we see come in have repented and changed their lives. They have not changed, and neither have you, Daniel, and neither have I. We are still the same screwed up bunch of people we always were. The Eucharist must be the only religious meal in the world. I don't know of another one where everybody is officially declared unworthy to eat every time they eat. So we're just there. Psychology Today magazine says North Americans tell hundreds of lies a day. Lovely to meet you. I'll be there in a minute. So forth. There are lots. We tell hundreds of them, and we don't stop. We liars get together in the Eucharist and share the presence of Christ without changing our lives much. It's nice that people change their lives, but you don't need to in order to share in the Eucharist. The Eucharist is given to all of us as we are. It's what Christ does, as Jesus did in Galilee in the first century, having people at the table, and in his parables are like that. Lots of the heroes of the parables are criminals.
Eating with all the wrong people.
Yeah, the criminals in Jesus' parables do not change their lives. You remark, go read them. They don't. So they're opportunists, and they don't change. So that's a part of what, I'm sorry, I'm getting off track.
No, you're never off track. This is where track is where you go. So what I'm noticing in these last 20 years is that what we call open table, inviting people to
Yes.
To communion before baptism, which was itself a scandalous practice in many places, in the Episcopal Church anyway, and some other Protestant churches, is not that scandalous. And I'm a part of a parish, lead a parish now that is very prominently and very proudly says, you are welcome as you are. It's very much a message of hospitality, that you belong, and it doesn't matter what your stripe is, you're welcome here. I hear you saying, though, and experiencing Gregory saying something slightly different, which is we're all equally declared unworthy. That's not quite the same hospitality message.
No, it's not. It's not. You don't put that on the sign outside the church. You just say you're all welcome and so forth. People already, in my experience as a parish priest, everybody thinks they're unworthy. Everybody expects the priest to tell them they're unworthy. That's not we don't need to worry about that. The Roman Catholics liturgical reform nowadays starts with the service talking about that. I don't favor talking about that. I prefer the Byzantine way of start about, let's have the Lord act. and but it's typical that people expect the church is going to tell them they're unworthy. So we might as that's one of the ways that that's one of the ways Jesus gave a sign how God deals with the unworthy. It's not, you can't earn God's forgiveness. God's already done it. Mm-hmm. God's already forgiven everybody, and Jesus and poured out Jesus' Spirit on everybody to receive it. So that's.
So if that's where we stand, where is for us in 2020 the growing edge as we come to understand what the Eucharist is and is doing? And I hope that's not a redundant question. You may have, again, just said it, but I'm always listening and looking for what is new and now and next as we continue the work.
Okay, let me give an example out of our history, which is that if we had left everybody just keeping their own traditional laws without changing anything, we would still have slavery everywhere. The reason we don't have slavery everywhere today is that people reading their Bibles, the Bible never condemns slavery. People reading their Bibles got the idea that God wants to end slavery and doesn't approve of it. The first preacher against slavery was Gregory of Nyssa. It went for a long time before anybody like him preached against slavery. So, but the idea eventually caught on. And that's an example, I think, of the Spirit of Christ at work. Now, what are we going to do next for ourselves? What is it? Slavery has stopped. Injustice has not stopped. We have plenty of injustice. If you want a handy example, people talk about reparations today. Yes, reparations really means what the Bible calls tzedakah, putting things right that are wrong, putting things right. And you must not forget the Native Americans. They have suffered more and been treated worse than any ethnic group in the Western Hemisphere. And today in America, they are the poorest ethnic groups. One of the reasons COVID-19 is so awful for the Navajo is that on their reservation, there are hundreds of elderly Navajo who don't even have running water. Why? Because we aren't doing what we could do to do justice. Our Congress already voted them a lot of money, which they don't get. It's possible to do justice. Make that as a good sign for yourself. And I think you don't have to remember the Tuaregs who are alone. I think Muslims have something to teach us. And today we are in the middle of Ramadan, I believe. Ramadan is the fasting month for them. When you have fasted all day, if you're a Muslim, you don't just eat and drink at night. You put food out on tables outside your house, and passersby and the poor can come to your house and feast with you there. That is an Austrian liturgical theologian, Clemens Leonhardt, whom I like very much, says he thinks that he can see signs of preaching that was once part of Christian and Jewish conversation, only we've forgotten to do it anymore. Mm. And there is a reason why you can find a way right nearby. As Basil, Gregory of Nyssa's elder brother, who, as I told last week, was a firebrand, Basil said, "Those extra shoes in your closet, they belong to the poor." And they say you can just go straight right. You can leave church and go right away and find something to go right home and find something to do. I have too many shoes in my closet.
So do I. So I'm trying to frame this next question that's kind of sitting in the back of my mind.
Well, you asked me what do people think they're doing in church?
Yeah,
and I think that's partly our responsibility in this conversation is to talk about that, because my experience visiting churches is that that's what people won't talk about. Why are they there? They don't talk about why they're there. So we're initiating, we're making this conversation happen. And that's talking about why they're there is one way that Christ shows up in the conversation of the people on why they're there.
When I've asked people why they're there, mostly I get answers that it feels like we've been told to say.
Yeah, right.
Whether it's to glorify God or because we feel better doing it, all good reasons.
Yes.
But one of the questions I continue to have and look to the Eucharistic gathering to keep answering is how to make that question feel like it's the real question to be having. I haven't gotten traction with that question yet. But what do you think you're doing?
Yes. Well, it's actually, what do you think we're doing?
What do you think you're doing?
There's the issue. I think Lewis Weil, did I talk about Lewis Weil already?
No, go.
Oh, Lewis Weil is a retired liturgy professor, and he lives in Oakland. And he's got an essay coming out this summer in another book, and a book of essays by lots of people. And he argues in there, because I read it, that the essential thing in communion is not receiving yourself the bread and wine as signs of Christ's presence. The essential thing in communion is the sharing. And if we're going to be doing something, making new liturgies up and so forth, and making obvious to people why they're there and so forth, make the sharing more obvious. That's what our next prayer book reform, if you're going to have one, should make that more obvious. And I think when you're one way to act on it today without the bread and wine, you're thinking about how to follow a Christ spirit that's present in the where Christians gather. It is, don't just go do this yourself. You don't need to find a couple of Christians to join you doing this, doing justice, doing forgiveness, and welcome non-Christians who would like to do it too. That's what Jesus' table was like.
So you're talking about the table now. I have a question has just popped into my mind, which I've never asked you before in all the years we've known each other, which was how did you first become arrested by this? What was it that made you say, oh, this is important to me, this really matters?
I could tell you how it happened.
Yeah.
I was on the summer high school exchange from my boarding school, Choate, which was an exchange that only went on for a few years. It turned out to be too expensive to run it, but it was between China and the United States. Now, we could not go to the mainland China at the time. We had Taiwan and Hong Kong and Japan. And we did a couple of years of exchanges. And when I was in Taiwan, I met some Chinese Christians my age who were taking this all very seriously. I was startled. I thought they had much more interesting religions all around them, and Christianity was rather dull. So but they were quite serious about it. So I came home and began reading in order to learn why they were wrong. I'm still trying to find that out. But that's how it happened. It was other Christians I met and who were quite serious about it.
And where did it lead you?
It led me to this program where we're having this conversation. Well, I went off to set. I'll tell you, if you want, one more personal experience. That when I was in college, I had like 4 Christian friends. Everybody else was post-Christian, I guess. And they thought I was crazy to be interested in this career. The church was ridiculous, out of touch, and corrupt. Those are true about the church, by the way. And it was It's something God has to deal with. But we, at the time came for me to be ordained a deacon. And the night before being ordained, the process of ordination was so screwed up at that point in my diocese. I won't bother to name it. It wasn't California. It was so screwed up. All I could think of was what my friends had said. This is ridiculous. It's dishonorable. Don't do this. It's not honorable at all. And it suddenly became clear to me, thinking about the people in China, it has got to be an honor to work in matters of life and death. If honor means anything, it has to mean, it has to be honorable to work and to serve your fellows in matters of life and death. And I do believe the gospel is a matter of life and death. So it makes the work honorable. And I think that is, you asked how I got here, that's it. First I was challenged because it didn't make sense to me, the way Jesus tabled with the wrong people at it didn't make sense. And then it became clear to me that the gospel is a matter of life and death, no matter how ridiculous and irrelevant I am and the church is and all of that. Nevertheless, the work is honorable because it's an honor to serve your fellows in matters of life and death. Soldiers do that. All kinds of firemen do it. There are all kinds of people. Nurses do that. That's honorable work.
Well, thank you. Thank you.